It's one thing for me to show up and talk about best practices and what I, understand generally out in the world. It's another thing for me to say, listen, we spoke to your people. These are direct quotes. These are direct experiences. And if you care about the impact of this, then let's talk about what we do. So I think making it very personal and relevant to what's happening within their organizations can kind of cut through some of that shifting that you mentioned. And then from there, we sort of use the best tools that we know based on what their challenges might be. But it's very hard to do this work if you're going to do it sort of off the shelf. Think about leaders who can build safety and open conversation, who are not afraid to have some of the difficult conversations with other people. And one of the things I'm working with my clients on right now is I think about leaders who are agile and resilient, right? Because the one thing we do know, I do not know what's going to happen 5 or 10 years from now in business or anywhere really, but I know there will be change and I know there will be new things to tackle. And people who have an open growth mindset, people who are generally resilient, who understand how to work through stress tolerance and all the things that come along with dealing with other people, I think those are the ones who end up on top when we think about leadership.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the All Innovation, the AI podcast. I'm your host, Keenan Hart. I've got my co-host here, Mr. Dante McLean, and we've got Cindy Joseph here with us today. She is the founder of the Cee Suite LLC. They create modern work strategies for inclusive workforces. Cindy, welcome to the show today. I'm excited for you to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to talk to you today.
As we kind of get into our conversation today, I want to ask you a little bit of an out-of-the-box question to kind of see where your brain goes with this. Okay. So if you had to give someone one superpower that was not yourself, who would you give it to and what would it be?
Ooh, and is this about work or anything?
This is about anything. So you've been blessed with the idea of Cindy. You can give someone one superpower. Yeah. Who is it going to be? It cannot be yourself. And what are you going to give them?
Okay. I think I got it. And I don't know a lot about like superhero stuff, so forgive me if I'm using the wrong terminology. I think it would be teleportation, like when you can instantly find yourself someplace else. And I would give it to my mom because she lives in Florida. I live in New York, and she is constantly on me that I don't go home enough. So I think she would really enjoy that.
Oh man, that's so awesome. When I was actually like writing up that question, I went to my mom as the exact same person. I was like, who can I trust with the power of a superpower who I know is not going to turn the world into a bad place? Has to be moms.
Yeah.
I love that.
Too. Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing. Well, Dante, why don't you kind of get us going, man?
Yeah, as we kind of take off here, Cindy, thanks for coming on the show. And I'm kind of curious, what do you feel you want the audience to take away from this conversation today? What's your desire?
When I think about all of these conversations that I have, I think my biggest desire is for people to walk away understanding that there's a different way. Excuse me, frog in my throat. I'll start over. When I think about a lot of these conversations that I'm having, I think the biggest thing I want people to take away is that we can do things differently. We don't have to stay the course and operate in ways that we traditionally have just because they're the way that things have been. I was just having a conversation earlier today about older generations and some of the frustrations with Gen Z and people who are just now entering the workforce. And the idea that I went through this hardship, this is what I had to do to pay my dues, and now it's your turn. And I'd love people to just open their minds to think, you know what, we created this, we can recreate it. And so, I don't know if that resonates in any way, but I'd love for people to walk away thinking about how can we recreate things in ways that work for us today.
My mom always had a saying when I was a kid. She said, be a leader, not a follower. And one of the things that I've always thought about as I've grown up and become more experienced in business and seen the ways in which kind of work is positioned in our lives, things are changing. Yeah. But primarily the responsibility of that change comes with the leaders of the organization. I want to say in our previous conversation, I might have referenced a book on one of the shelves behind me. It's called 12 and a Half, Leveraging the Emotional Ingredients Necessary for Business Success. It's a book by Gary Vaynerchuk, goes by Gary V on social media. And it talks about the soft skills, empathy, compassion, curiosity, kind candor, as the soft skills that need to be leveraged as a leader to meet this new generation of people where they're at, because they have a completely different expectation to work than what we had. Just because we grew up in a time where we had to work in coal mines does not mean Gen Z, who grew up with an iPad, does not have to do the same things. And so my question for you would be, which is from a previous guest, his name was Chris Powell. He wants to ask, what do you think it will take to be a phenomenal leader over the next 5 years?
Honestly, a lot of the things that you just mentioned are the things that I think about, that I'm focused on, that I help coach people on. So organizations are oftentimes focused on the functional skills, the technical parts of the role. And oftentimes that's what people get promoted into people management based on, right? You're doing a great job making whatever widgets you make. You're great at executing. You're crushing it at all the things. And now suddenly you've got to lead other people, which is a whole different skill set. You have to be mindful of other people's temperaments, what other people are bringing into the office, what motivates different people, what demotivates others. And I think the skills that we really need to be mindful of as we think about leadership in the next 5 years are things like emotional intelligence, right? The ability to not only understand what's going on with you and to manage your own triggers and self-regulate and things of that nature, but also to have this sense of what's happening with other people around me. Am I picking up on important cues and responding in ways that are productive? I think about leaders who can build safety and open conversation, who are not afraid to have some of the difficult conversations with other people. And one of the things I'm working with my clients on right now is I think about leaders who are agile and resilient, right? Because the one thing we do know, I do not know what's going to happen 5 or 10 years from now in business or anywhere really, but I know there will be change and I know there will be new things to tackle. And people who have an open growth mindset, people who are generally resilient, who understand how to work through stress tolerance and all the things that come along with dealing with other people, I think those are the ones who end up on top when we think about leadership.
Where do you think these leaders in this emerging workforce can start? So they're maybe listening to this podcast, like, hey, I want to, work on emotional intelligence. I want to be more self-aware. Where do they start?
I think self-awareness is the place to start. It's hard to lead other people if you are not sure how to lead yourself, if you don't understand what motivates you, what triggers you, what helps you feel most fulfilled. And that starts with first understanding who you are, what you value. One of the things we do with leaders when we're training them is helping them to tease out values. And to be honest, even as someone who does this work all the time, it's not like I sit there every day and think about what are my personal values. But when you're sitting there and you're forced to really narrow down and prioritize, is it more important for me to be a creative and innovative person? Is it more important for me to give to community? Is it more important for me to have flexibility and balance? All of those things help you understand who you are. And it also helps you understand when things are going haywire around you, when you have to make tough decisions and judgment calls. What are the things that you're going to prioritize? How are you going to lean on those values to help you decide what's the right way to go? So I think that self-awareness is probably the place that I would start, Dante. And two great ways to do that are, taking an assessment. There are lots of emotional intelligence assessments and personality assessments that we can do, and getting feedback, asking people who you really trust and who will tell you the truth. I mean, that's the most important thing about getting feedback from other people who be real with you. Getting that information so that you've got some insights to reflect on and start to build on.
One of the things I would love for you to kind of share with the audience, because we're talking about self-awareness, is sometimes when we find ourselves unhappy in a certain path in our career, we have to pivot. In our previous conversation, we laughed a little bit about you trading in a 9-to-5 for a 24/7 365. Absolutely. So I want you to kind of talk about your jump from the Fortune 500 world into starting your own business, and what was the motivation behind that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I worked in corporate for 17 years. For most of that time, never thought I would be an entrepreneur. My parents are actually entrepreneurs. I don't know if I mentioned that before. And yet it never occurred to me. I was great where I was moving up every couple years, I had a great lifestyle, and it wasn't perfect. Like, I definitely dealt with my share of all kinds of workplace situations that I had to navigate. And I also felt like I could do this, right? For me, things started to change when there were just a few things that were kind of gnawing at me that it was just getting harder and harder for me to ignore. So, the first thing I thought about were my own personal experiences.
I mean, let's dive in a little bit deeper. Let me double click on that. What were some of those things that are starting to pop up that you can't ignore? Like, let's kind of share the audience experience.
Yeah. There was my own experience of some microaggressions at work, getting looked over for certain things that I felt like were a bit unfair. Corporate politics, let's just, put it that way. And there were definitely times, I don't think it was intentional, but I felt a bit tokenized in my experience as like a relatively senior Black woman in the spaces that I was in. But to be honest, I felt like I had control over a lot of those things. It was the fact that I was mentoring a lot of people, and they would come to me with their stories, and they were having a really hard time navigating the environment. And for me, like, I'm looking at that, I'm looking at my experience. I'm also looking around and questioning the outcomes for a lot of the people who I saw come in and out of the workforce. And that was starting to weigh on me a bit. The other thing that I thought a lot about was, even though I really enjoyed aspects of my work, like the parts of the thing that I enjoy were, harder and harder to do as I became more senior. So I was like a roll your sleeve up, give me a blank sheet of paper, I got you kind of person. And the more senior you become, I was managing a really large team. I'm literally sitting in meetings, working on budgets all day. And if I'm not doing that, I was on the road for weeks at a time. So the work wasn't really as interesting and fulfilling to me. And just from a human perspective, I had been working 17 years nonstop. I think in that time the longest I took was maybe like a 10-day vacation or something like that. And my last couple years of working was just not sustainable. Like I said, I was managing a large team. I was traveling all the time, and I get pulled into business things, even though I was in the talent space. I was just starting to wonder if that was the life that I wanted to lead, and if there wasn't something that was just more aligned with what would fulfill me, my talents, and how I wanted to spend my time.
When you talk about being or feeling tokenized, I resonate with that sentiment for sure. And I'm curious how you feel that you've brought in some of these elements of not wanting to be viewed that way or not wanting to be perceived that way into some of the work that you're doing now at the Cee Suite.
Yeah, great question. The first thing I think about is everyone is at their own different personal place as it relates to this journey, this learning journey, and embracing of how the workplace is just changing. And I think it's changing more quickly than ever. So I do give some grace for some of the experiences I had. I don't think that they were intentional. I think I had a lot of great colleagues. And also because there are a lot of things that we don't talk about, a lot of things that get pushed under the rug. A lot of us go with the flow in terms of how things go, right? How things are. And so I do, and I have given some grace for, I don't think it's intentional that people tokenize people of color or people of difference from time to time. That said, my role when I go into organizations is, is to help educate people, to help bring awareness to some of the experiences that they may be skipping over, that they may be pushing under the rug, that are difficult for people inside to talk about, either because it's too painful or frankly, one of the reasons I thought I could do this work really well is because I can be much more authentic doing it from the outside. And so there are lots of people on the inside that want to say something, and they're also trying to navigate, well, is this going to hurt my chances of a promotion? Is this going to hurt my careers or my internal relationships? And so part of what we do is we go in and help to raise awareness around some of these issues and set some common ground, some common language in a way that we're all learning. It's not judgmental. It's not a shame and blame. And we still think it's important that we're talking about these things so that you're not making these same mistakes with your colleagues.
It's such an interesting time to think about kind of the landscape of work, the landscape of society as well, and how those two things kind of influence each other. You know, one of the things we talked about in our previous conversation was a concept of the frozen middle. Mm-hmm. So we have organizations who rush to say, we are inclusive, we are DE&I moving forward. And the Cee Suite and leadership pushes these initiatives down, but higher level managers and leaders in HR positions and directors often find themselves in something called the frozen middle. The frozen middle means I can't push initiatives up because there's a disconnect with the employees who are beneath me. It's very difficult for me to push things down from the C-suite because maybe I don't have the resources or the time. How do you kind of think about that frozen middle? I know we had a little bit of a conversation on that last time. So what's your 2 cents?
Yeah. You know, the importance of engaging that middle layer of managers is something I've been talking about with my clients for years. It's probably one of the most important things I think that we do, right? They have so much impact on the experience and the growth of their teams. And a lot of times there just isn't really enough focus and resources put toward how they're being developed, how they're guiding other people. And on a real human level, how do they navigate and cope with the pressures of just what you said, right? They need to motivate other people. They need to deliver whatever it is they're responsible for delivering. And, you know, they've got the pressures from up top and they're trying to grow and manage their own careers, right? So it's just a lot of responsibility. And unfortunately, most people who are people leaders just don't receive support, training, instruction on how to do it or what is expected, right? So you've got all these factors at play. And I think that can breed a lot of uncertainty and fear, which can lead that group to block or stall innovation and change. The reason we talk about it so pointedly with our clients is because if you can imagine what it takes to succeed with DEI, it takes energy, it takes imagination, it takes a willingness to change. And I think it's great to have that grassroots energy at the bottom, and you definitely need that support at the top. But a lot of the people who are going to execute, who are going to engage, and certainly who can block things, right, who can block the work for those on the ground, those are managers. And so if they're not feeling supported, if they don't buy in, I think a lot of the work can stall. So there are definitely some things that I think we can do to help engage that frozen middle, as you say, as we think about the importance of this work.
Keenan had a really beautiful intro, but can you help me catch the audience up to what you do exactly at the C-Suite so they have better context?
Yeah, so we're a talent management consultancy. And so for people who aren't familiar with talent management, not talent management in the entertainment space, but your recruiting, your hiring, your performance management, how you train people, how do you coach people, mentor people, all of those things sit within the talent management space. And what we do is we go into organizations and we help them think about how do they modernize their talent initiatives. How do they make them more impactful and effective? How do they align them with what people need and what the organization is looking for as well? And we're specifically focused on talent management as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership development. All of these things are intertwined. So I tell people, you can absolutely come to me for a recruiting project. I will do it because I have a lot of experience doing recruiting. And whether or not you ask for it, there's going to be equity and inclusion as part of whatever outcome we're giving to you. So that's a little bit about what we do.
How do we, just really quick, how do we get past just the, there's such I feel like there's such a stigma happening around DEI nowadays over the last few years. And how do you get past the stigma and really get to the core, the root issue, right? And really drive home some of these core principles, because it's all about change, right? You're really implementing a new way of looking at the world through the company's eyes. So what are some of the processes that you take people through so they can really grasp this concept in the way that it needs to be understood?
Yeah. We're hearing and seeing a lot of this conversation around the language shifting, the interest shifting. I think there's a lot of risk aversion right now with DEI. People think diversity is a target. we've had clients, and this has been a few years coming, but clients raise concerns about people bringing politics into the office and things that they hadn't had to deal with before, but people feel empowered to bring these conversations, which in some ways, if it's handled artfully, could move people, but in other ways can be very divisive if you're not careful. Yeah. And part of what I try to do is to bring people back to the core issues, right? So firstly, what are you trying to achieve? What outcomes are important to you? And what outcomes are important to your people? And from there, we start to assess, well, where are you today? Based on what you're telling me your priorities are, based on what you're telling me you actually want to achieve as it relates to, this work in your workplace. And so a lot of that ends up us going in and assessing the organization, spending time really getting to know people at different career levels, different departments, obviously different identities and lived experiences. And I think going back to that core and having that information can help kind of sift through the noise a bit. So this isn't about tagline. This isn't about something that you've seen on social media. This isn't about things that are happening outside of your door necessarily. This is what your people are asking for. This is what people are actually experiencing. And it's one thing for me to show up and talk about best practices and what I, understand generally out in the world. It's another thing for me to say, listen, we spoke to your people. These are direct quotes. These are direct experiences. And if you care about the impact of this, then let's talk about what we do. So I think making it very personal and relevant to what's happening within their organizations can kind of cut through some of that shifting that you mentioned. And then from there, we sort of use the best tools that we know based on what their challenges might be. But it's very hard to do this work if you're going to do it sort of off the shelf. Let's just take the best practices and hope that it works.
One of my favorite sayings from a previous guest was, we should remember that before there was HR, before there was the acronym of DE&I, there were human beings who cared.
Yeah.
And it sounds like getting back to that human element is something that is an interesting time where we have leaders like you who will come into the organization and try and churn up, if you will, the information and the feedback to talk about the humanistic element of a company and what people are really asking for. I feel like that's such an interesting time in history to kind of be sitting as a leader who recognizes the importance of this. Why do you feel like organizations and brands you work with have gotten so far away from that in the first place?
In one word, capitalism. I mean, listen, we work with businesses primarily. We do have some nonprofit clients and every now and again, university or something of that nature. But, when you're working with businesses, obviously the thing that is probably top of mind in terms of priorities are, can we stay in business? Can we generate revenue? Can we meet, our shareholder expectations and things of that nature? And sometimes there's a disconnect between treating their teams as fully human, as people who have lives outside of work and interests outside of work and need to be motivated and engaged, from like just driving hard to get at whatever that business result is. And I actually try to bring people a little bit closer together to help folks understand, listen, if you are setting up organizations where you are paying attention, where you are having people feel seen, heard, supported, understood, you are more likely to get the outcomes and results that you want on the business side, because people can focus, people can bring the best of themselves to the workplace. People are appreciative of those types of workplaces. But I do think the pursuit of like profit at all costs can sometimes muddy the waters between that goal and also making sure that we have empathy and humanity and all of those things in the workplace.
Do you feel like we're seeing a difference in generations? A good example is, I grew up in the 1990s, early 2000s. I grew up in the Metro Detroit area. And so I saw how people at that point in time were living to work. But now it seems like on the other side of the pandemic, people are working to live. But it seems like a lot of the leaders of our organizations today came from that previous living to work generation. And it seems like the living to work mentality also comes with an expectation to drive as much profit out of the business as possible. Mm-hmm. But now you have an employee group and workforce that is coming in to say, I'm just here so I can get paid enough so I can leave and go experience life. So do you think there's like maybe a friction that's happening between those two generations of what is the true motivation of being in work and what is kind of it positioned as in our lives?
Yeah, and I think we touched on this a little bit, and I will say, I mean, obviously we're speaking in generalizations. It's not necessarily true of everyone who sits within a particular generational experience, but I do think our understanding of work, its purpose in our lives, and what we're meant to get out of it is evolving. And there are definitely many people who, for work, that's their identity. And you ask them about themselves when you first meet them, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is what it is that they do. By the way, I'm not saying that anything is wrong with that necessarily, but it is a shift in how we tend to think about the place of work in our lives. So there can be a lot of friction around that. My team and I have actually been discussing, there have been recent articles about frustration with younger generations and how they're showing up in the workforce, perhaps not having as much what I would call perceived commitment to the work. Obviously, over the last few years, we've heard, quiet quitting has come into our lexicon, and I just heard quiet vacationing.
One of my favorites is a minimal effort Mondays
Yeah,
as well, which I've heard.
And so I think we're all having to examine, are we focused on the same things? Do we have the same values? And what does that mean for working together and collaborating in the workplace? And in some sense, what I have been seeing in this discourse is people kind of talking like this, kind of missing each other and not necessarily sitting down and thinking about what are our common goals? Where do we agree? Where do we disagree? And what are the things that we can do to help bridge those gaps? So I think certainly people who've been in the workforce for a long time could stand to examine, do we have to do things in this way? And this is not only about a generational thing. I talk a lot about it with DEI. Even things as simple as work style, outside of the whole identity conversation. But is this a preference, or is this an actual way that we need to operate in order to get things done? And do we have to put people through the ringer because that's the experience that we had? Like, wouldn't it be nice if we can create the workplaces that we wished we would have had when we were coming up? And on the flip side, for people who are just joining the workforce, I would think about, what are my deal breakers? But everything can't be a deal breaker, right? Like, we're all operating in the same system trying to survive, right? So as you're raising important issues about what you care about and what you need from a workplace, what are the things that you can be okay with while we work to change? Because everything can't happen all at once. And it's hard for people to mentor you and to pour into you if you're also closed off to that experience as well. So, like if I were, brokering a cross-cultural or cross-generational, conversation around this, that's really where I would start with the groups.
I'd love to get your take on some of the advancements in technology. So, part of what you said was kind of funny. It was like, if you just treat people right, like you'll get better outcomes. And it seems so obvious, right? Common sense isn't common to everyone, but when we're looking ahead at the future of work, one of the interesting topics that Keenan and I were exploring was the idea of potentially companies collapsing in size because of the advent of artificial intelligence. There was a text. There's a text thread that Sam Altman was talking about. So Sam Altman's the founder of OpenAI, ChatGPT, everyone knows and loves. And he has a text thread with some of the most successful CEOs, tech CEOs in the world. And they're all betting on when the first $1 billion one-person company is going to come about. Some people think 6 months, a year, a couple years. And so I'm curious what you feel the role in AI and in this idea that companies might not need to be as large, just because artificial intelligence could fill some of these roles. I'm curious your 2 cents on that.
6 months, wow. That's a little
quick.
That is a little aggressive. I never thought about it hitting that close that fast. Listen, I think there are a lot of really, really smart people around business and technology. You probably will give you a better answer around that. I am sure that AI, like other innovations, across history, will change the workforce. Will probably change who is doing what job, how many people you need in certain positions, and I don't doubt that that's going to have an impact on our workforce. I think the idea that AI can replace everything within an organization is probably a bit overblown. And it may depend on, the type of organization that you have, but I think about the topic that we're, focused on when you think about people, HR, those sorts of things. I think if you have people, you're going to need people to interpret and to make some really thoughtful, intentional decisions around that group. So I don't know that personally, I don't know that I'm scared about losing my place because of AI, but I understand the frenzy around, well, what does this mean for the future of work and the type of thing that I can find myself doing? I think we would all be smart to figure out how we can partner with AI and partner with these technical tools to make our jobs better and easier, and let the chips fall where they may when they do.
I'm really interested in the topic, and I'm kind of going to go off kilter a little bit here. But technology in itself has always almost acted as a mirror to society. Okay. Social media is not a platform that has a whole bunch of people saying negative stuff because social media brings that out of us. It's kind of the tubes in which we disseminate information, right? When I think of AI, I almost think of AI as being something of a savior that takes us away from a lot of the redundant work that a lot of people say they don't enjoy doing. So when you talk to people who say, I hate my job, it's because I have to sit on the computer all day. I answer phone calls. I talk to people who are complaining. I do all this type of stuff, and it doesn't sound fulfilling. What happens now when technology is positioned as saying, you don't have to do any of that work anymore? Are we going to then be accountable enough to position ourselves in work that we enjoy? Or are we going to find ourselves doing things that maybe we don't like, and we kind of are almost addicted to the process of complaining about how work is positioned in our lives? What's kind of your 2 cents on that?
Probably a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I do think it'll free us up to find other things to do. And hopefully a lot of us can find other things that are, if not things that we enjoy, at least things that are strategic, keep us learning, are interesting problems to solve, and things of that nature. I think I was mentioning before, I use, at the very least, generative AI every day. And it's essentially become a little bit of a thought partner for me. So I don't feel like it's replaced anything, because I still think most of the things I get are like not 100%.
Not it.
But it's a great way for me to bounce ideas back and forth and develop ideas and get some really foundational outlines together that I then build on based on my own experience and expertise. So one of the things I think about is when we're using AI to help us do our jobs, like if we're smart, we're going to find ways to enhance the work. And then what we're going to do is use our experience, our common sense, the things that are hard to pick up in data, or that the data just can't capture in the way that human feeling, emotion can. And then we're going to add, our expertise to help make better decisions, faster decisions, things of that nature. I am 100% sure there will also still be people who are not satisfied, because that's just human nature, I guess. But I also don't know that the goal is that everyone finds a job where they're happy, and hopefully we can find work that's fulfilling and that we're passionate about. And sometimes work is just that, and that can be okay too, depending on who you are.
Yeah, it's just such an interesting time, because we continuously kind of think about, especially if we're talking about HR, right? The bell curve of adoption, if you will, often does not have a huge chunk of HR leaders in that space, because we come from a place that has been based on processes and systems. And a lot of the times we're part of organizations that are not that technologically forward thinking. Mm-hmm. And so when we hear about the evangelists in the marketplace who are talking about AI being the replacement for everything, it's often the startup or the founder who's also trying to raise $200 million. And so they kind of create a little bit of an interesting pitch across the landscape. And it's like, unless we used a perfect word earlier in our conversation, imagination, unless we can hone our sense of imagination to be able to understand what could this mean to us, then I feel like we're going to find ourselves being reactionary, when now is the real opportunity for leaders like you to be able to really lean into the fact of, I can use this AI as a thought partner. Now I can multiply myself, get better ideas, have a faster feedback loop, which I feel like is such an opportunity for us.
And we have to be careful about AI. I mean, it's pretty ubiquitous now, and it feels like it's moving and progressing and embedding itself into our work pretty quickly. At the same time, there are a lot of risks, certainly for people who are not checking the AI, who are accepting whatever the outputs are as the absolute and right outputs. For people who think that because I'm not using a human to make this decision, then it is unbiased. Like, there are a lot of things that we need to be careful about. And I think, at least for the time being, our judgment needs to be very much, especially when you're dealing with people issues, needs to be part of that equation.
I love what you said when you were speaking to AI is really good at augmenting what you want to do, but you don't want it to solve all your problems, and neither should it, right? I think there's a very human element needed within the conversation of AI to really advance kind of what we're doing. And I'm curious your 2 cents on creating a culture of psychological safety in this new world of AI, where we have two camps, right? So some people are like, it's the best thing since sliced bread, one person company, $1 billion valuation overnight. Other people are like, hey, this is really scary. I don't know what my role in the future looks like. I'm sure maybe you've had some of these conversations, or you're thinking about some of these conversations. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I haven't thought about how do we create psychological safety around the use of AI, though I could imagine if I was sitting in front of someone who I was leading and they came to me with some hesitation or trepidation about it, what I would probably do is coach them through, firstly, what are the fears, right? Trying to understand what those blockers are, and to see if there are ways that we can knock those down or address them, or sometimes even validate them if they're fears that are well-founded. And then start to move into a conversation around, well, what are your goals? And are there ways that this tool can maybe help you achieve those goals that you haven't considered? And what are the ways that we can think about pairing your skills and elevating them with the AI? I think it's also worth having a conversation around the things that AI is just not going to be able to do, right? So it's interesting. I've heard of some programs coming up where AI can coach you on things. And you probably heard this too. Like, you could, like, there's a keyboard now where it'll, like, if you're trying to date, it'll like tell you what you should say. Respond if you're texting to someone.
Game AI.
Game AI. I gotta be honest. I've been using ChatGPT, the voice function, to learn Portuguese, and it's been
like, it
really
can teach you a lot, right? It can teach you a lot. It can coach you a lot. And I guarantee there are certain times where it's just going to have limitations, right? So right. I can get all the coaching I want on how to talk to someone over text if I'm trying to date them, or if I'm trying to coach an employee, if we bring it back to work. At some point, we're going to need to sit face to face and be able to relate to each other as humans, and be able to, like, empathize as human beings, and to see each other in that way. And if that is what the other person needs or desires, and most people, I think, still do, there are just going to be limitations to how far AI can take us. And so really putting all of that into context may help someone who's a little scared about the future of AI as it relates to their work, may help with a little bit of that safety that you brought up, Dante.
What are we thinking about the future of, DEI inclusion in the workforce? Where do you think we're going?
I think it's here to stay, but I do think it has to evolve. And I've been on a roller coaster. First of all, I've been doing this work for, I don't know, 20 something years, but the last 2 years have been a roller coaster. It was, we couldn't do things fast enough to, over the last year, it kind of feels like the conversation has, I won't say fallen off of a cliff, but like gotten really toxic in some ways. The thing that really I find angering and hurtful is when people say things like, DEI means didn't earn it. All the progress that we have seen for people who've been working really hard, probably harder than most, to achieve what they have, and to distill that to DEI, like those things are really hurtful to me. That said, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think that if there is something that has come out of this time period, it's that the companies that are still doing this, the programs that are surviving, people are starting to examine, well, what is different about this, and how do we approach this in a way that's not like a Band-Aid and a window dressing, and really thinking about putting some rigor behind the work, and thinking about it the way that we think about other areas of business that we find important, right? If you have a CMO, you're going to make sure they've got a budget, they have a team, they've got, some KPIs and some strategic plans in place for how they're going to up-level your marketing. And I think the DEI programs that are surviving and that are going to come out of this period are the ones that have that level of seriousness and rigor around them. And I think we're going to continue to evolve the work. So bringing in as many people as we can, not having one-dimensional types of conversation. And I think it's going to be bumpy for a while. I mean, we're in an election year. The economy is what it is. Let's just put it that way. And I think there are a lot of reasons why the social environment is what it is right now. And so, I think organizations are going to have to be very strong and stay the course if we're going to ride this part of the landscape, but it'll be here.
Yeah. I mean, we're all excited for the future. I realize that what got us here will not get us there. Yeah. We have to be, curious. We have to be humble enough to recognize what things we can do differently. The humanistic nature of work in itself is something that we have to continue to prioritize, because it seems like Dante said so succinctly, you treat people well, you get good results. And sometimes it's just breaking it down to first principles, which I feel like is just so necessary for us to remind people of. I want to use the last couple seconds here of the podcast to give you the opportunity to pose a question for our next guest. What would you like to ask the next guest on the All Innovation AI podcast?
Do I have any clue as to who your next guest is?
You do not. This is kind of the tradition of it is, we just blindly introduce you guys and you're connected via the questions that we ask each other. So it can be anything. It can be about life. It can be about work. It can be about HR. It can be about innovation. It could be about, the best way to raise a dog. It doesn't really matter. We just want to kind of, what are you interested in learning, somebody?
But they're typically a founder or a leader. So some context around the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you had a magic wand and could create one innovation for the workplace, what would it be and why?
That is an amazing question. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, for myself and Dante, we just want to say, Cindy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been such an insightful conversation, hearing your perspective, the journey in which you've gone down, the things that we're looking for the future, and what the future of work looks like. Is going to be an amazing journey to be able to follow when we've got leaders like you who are making, substantial change in the organizations that we see every day. So for everybody watching and listening, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.